Welcome, everyone. Again, my name is William Hild. I'm the Deputy Director of the Regulatory Transparency Project. On behalf of RTP, I'd like to welcome both our guests and our illustrious panelists. The Regulatory Transparency Project promotes a national conversation about the costs and benefits of federal, state, and local regulatory policies and explores areas for possible improvement in our regulatory schema. You can follow our work and the work of our working group members at regprojects.org, where we publish a range of content from white papers to videos, podcast series, and teleforums. We're excited to have an incredible panel today to discuss the release of this paper, and I'm actually not going to tell you about any of them because Miss Linda Chavez is going to do that for us. But before she does that, I'm going to introduce her. She is the chairman of the Center for Equal Opportunity, the progenitor of today's report. She's also a senior fellow at the Niskanen Center, and she has served, and if you can get this, I left things out, as the chairman of National Commission on Migrant Education. She has been the White House Director of Public Liaison, the staff director of U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, and she served a 4-year term as the U.S. expert to the UN Subcommission of the Prevention of Discrimination and Protection of Minorities. And last but certainly not least, in 2000, she was honored by the Library of Congress as a living legend for her contributions to America's cultural and historical legacy. And I had to point that out, Linda, because if you're going to be named a type of legend, living is definitely the one you want to shoot for. So without further ado, I'll hand things over to her, and if our panelists would like to come up and join her on the podium as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to work with the Federalist Society in putting this project together. As some of you know, the Center for Equal Opportunity, we've been around since 1995, and I was the founding person of the center, and we have done over the years many studies, really dozens of studies on college admissions, and particularly the use of race and racial preference in college admissions. And so this is the latest in these studies. We did one last year on Harvard University, and today we're going to be talking about 5 schools in the state of Virginia. We've looked at Virginia before. In fact, in 1996 and in 1999, CEO produced studies that looked at relative admissions odds at several universities, and University of Virginia and William and Mary were 2 of the schools we looked at. And so it's going to be interesting today to hear from Althea Nagai, whom I'll introduce a little bit more fully as she presents her paper. I will just tell you that keep in mind that when we looked at this issue in 1996, the odds ratio of a black and white applicant with the identical grades and test scores was 33 to 1. In 1999, that jumped to 111 to 1. So you're going to be hearing more today. I will just preview it by saying the good news is, while preference is still being used, it is somewhat less than it was in the past. And one of the things that always irritates me about Washington advocacy groups is that we always have to be crying, the sky is falling. Well, sometimes it's not falling quite as fast, or things are getting slightly better, and I think it's incumbent on us to point that out. So we'll hear more from Althea about that. And I would now like to take the opportunity to introduce you to Althea Nagai, and I'll introduce you to the panel after Althea comes up. Althea is a research fellow at the Center for Equal Opportunity. She has been involved in these studies from the very beginning, right? From the very beginning, going back to the 1996, as a co-author and now as the primary author of our studies. So Althea, if you'll come on up and present your study, and then I'll introduce you to the fine fellows to my right.
Okay. I'm gonna give a report on the 5 public universities at Virginia. University of Virginia, William and Mary, Virginia Tech, James Madison, and George Mason. Okay. I want to start with the comment that these universities are large universities. I mean, Virginia Tech has a campus of maybe, I think, 27,000 students. You know, they number in the 20,000s. They have a large number of applicants. But this is not unusual for these schools nowadays, where most students from high school applying to college, I saw at U.S. News that they're recommended to apply to 7 to 10 schools, okay? So if you figure on average they're applying to 10 schools, that means a lot of these universities with national reputations are going to have a lot of applicants. And this is what we found. UVA had 35,000 applicants in the year we looked at. The rest of them all number, 20-something thousand applicants, and they have just a few thousand seats that they have to fill. Okay, so they also know that of all that they admit, there's a certain percentage that's probably not going to attend, although as we know from Virginia Tech, they sometimes underestimate how much end up going. Okay, so there's a lot of estimation going on here. I'd also like to comment that the large number of applicants, this has always been my theory, that once College Board allowed these major universities to use the common application form, you see applications skyrocketing because it doesn't require a lot more effort to do a new application for each individual institution. So you have, and the other thing that adds to the number of applicants is the notorious U.S. News and World Report ranking. Now, of these 5 schools, UVA ranked, at the time we did the study, UVA ranked at 25th. William and Mary was 38. Virginia Tech was 75, I think, and George Mason was 138. James Madison was the one listed among the regional elite national universities. So they're getting a lot of press coverage. So with these things in mind, the admissions officers are faced with the decision of having to figure out how to create a pool of admittees. Now, how do we know, or how do we suspect that race is being used as a factor? Well, when we always do a study, the first thing I do is to ask for these large data sets. I ask for the complete data set, asking for admission status. I asked for gender. I asked for whether they had alum connections, test scores, grades, race of the applicant, and whether they were in-state or out-of-state residents. So I asked this of every single applicant. So for UVA, we had 30-something thousand rows of applicants. And this was the same thing we did for every single school, so we could also contrast across schools. Now, let's start with just admission rate by race. Okay, at UVA and at William and Mary, it looks like blacks get some kind of preference. And the reason is 35% of black applicants at UVA were admitted, compared to 32% of Hispanics, 32% of Asians, and 30% of whites. At William and Mary, 41% of blacks who applied were admitted, as were half the Hispanic applicant pool, 37% of Asians, and 35% of whites. Okay, so for the rest of the other 3, Virginia Tech, James Madison, and George Mason, it flipped around. You had much larger percentage of admits for Asians and whites compared to blacks and Hispanics. And I think for these other 3 schools, the overall admission rate was something like in the 70s, and George Mason, I think, was 80%. So they had much less stringent admission requirements compared to the 2 elite schools. So we really ended up with two different kinds of schools. We had William and Mary and UVA versus Virginia Tech, George Mason, and James Madison. So having set this up, the next question is, how much of an advantage? Well, the first thing we have to do is look at differential test scores and grades. As often cited, there is a large test score gap between blacks and whites and blacks and Asians at the two elite schools, William and Mary and UVA. For total SAT, it came out to UVA was 180 points among admittees. At William and Mary, it was 190 points, comparing blacks and whites. It's comparable when comparing blacks and Asians. The gap was somewhat smaller when you did Hispanics and whites, Hispanics, and Asians. The similar kind of pattern occurred when we looked at ACT scores. We had a huge disparity between at UVA and William and Mary, and less so at these other three schools. What surprised me was the relatively narrow, very, very narrow grade point gap. There was very little difference in the average grade points among those admitted between whites, blacks, Hispanics, and Asians at every school. I think there was, I would consider a small gap of like 0.2, a 20th of a point. We didn't find that. Most of the time it was, maybe 0.1 something difference on a 4-point scale we had, or a 5-point scale. So the grades were much closer together, which led me to think that grades have become a major factor in terms of determining admission. And I have to comment as a side point, with the advent of this AP mania, and that Virginia has Virginia Standards for Education. There's a greater standardization of the college pre-collegiate curriculum than ever before. So it's not, it wouldn't surprise me that grades have played a larger role in terms of determining admissions. Nevertheless, we still have some disparities. And the way to really get at these disparities is to look at what I set up as regression equations. Okay, now we're going to get into the mathy stuff. The regression equations, logistic regression equations, in which we look at whether any candidate, the odds of blacks being admitted over whites, but we can also add in statistical controls for gender, alum connections, academic qualifications, and residency, in-state or out-of-state. Because maybe a lot of this disparity is really a function of giving preference, because they're state universities, given preference to in-state residents. Well, let's see. For both UVA and William and Mary, we still had extremely large odds ratios favoring black applicants over whites, even when controlling for all these other factors. They were much larger than preference given to being a resident of Virginia. The Hispanic preference was not as large. For Virginia Tech, there was a small preference given to blacks over whites, but not an enormous one. There was no preference at James Madison, blacks to whites, and at George Mason, the preference was given, a small preference was actually given to whites over blacks. That was, and I believe a similar preference was given to whites over Hispanics. And for all 5 schools, there was preference given to whites over Asians, controlling for all these other factors. At the 3 big universities that were not very competitive, the largest factor was residence, but not in the way one would think. At Virginia Tech, the out-of-state residents received preference, all other things being equal. The same was the case for James Madison, although not as large. And at George Mason, that was, if you were an out-of-state resident applying to George Mason, the odds ratios were 12-1 over being a Virginia resident. So this was quite a change from what it was when we did the report in the 1990s. They have jiggled the numbers a bit. There has been a reduction. As Linda pointed out, what happened in the 1990s, there was way more just flat out giving preference on the basis of race. That's been reduced substantially. It's still there, but as the lawyers will tell you, that's still legal. So this is kind of the state of Virginia. I don't know to what extent it would apply to other competitive states. A lot of this, I think, has to do with a lot of these schools being very well known nationally because of U.S. News. So you get a much larger pool of applicants. This is very much changed from what was going on in the 1990s. So that's the end of the numbers.
Thank you very much, Althea. And Althea will be back up here for the question and answer period for those of you who have questions. Now I'd like to introduce our panel because you've got the study before you. You've had a bit of a snapshot of what the numbers are. And now the question is, how does this conform to the law? What does it mean in terms of public policy, and is it a good or a bad thing? And so we have people on the panel, I think, who are going to talk about it from a variety of perspectives. I'm going to introduce everyone at once, and then I'm going to ask for them to stay at their places, and they can speak seated. Hans von Spakovsky is a senior legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation. He is a former member of the Federal Elections Commission and a former member of the U.S. Civil Rights Commission. Actually, I think when I was chair of the State Advisory Board, he was on that State Advisory Board. And he is a 1984 graduate of Vanderbilt Law School. Next, we'll hear from Todd Gaziano, who is Chief of Legal Policy and Strategic Research at the Pacific Legal Foundation. He was the founding director of the Heritage Legal Center. He was actually a commissioner at the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights for 6 years. I think he also served, did you not also serve on the State Advisory Board for a time with me? I think you did. And his law degree is from the University of Chicago Law School. And finally, we are happy to welcome Ted Shaw, who is Director for Civil Rights and the Julius Chambers Professor of Law at the University of North Carolina Law School. He is formerly the Director, Counsel, and President of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and he was the lead counsel in the case, the Gratz case at the University of Michigan, which had to do with admissions as an undergraduate, and the challenge was that they were giving preference on the basis of race. And we expect to hear some more about that, and it may, in fact, the Gratz decision may, in fact, in part, I think, explain some of the changes we've seen between 1966 and 99 and today in terms of the degree of preference. And Ted received his law degree from Columbia University. So without further ado, I'll ask each of our speakers to speak for about 10 minutes. I'll then invite Althea to come back up, and we'll open it up to question and answers. Hans?
Thanks, Linda. Excuse me. I should add, by the way, that I'm going to be talking to you. I come at this from both a personal standpoint, because I'm a resident of Virginia, and I have 3 children who've gone through public schools in Virginia, including the state college system, but also as a lawyer. And in addition to my other experience, I spent 4 years in the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice enforcing our federal civil rights laws. We know that the Ivy League schools, which refer to themselves as the elite colleges and universities of the country, are engaging in blatant, illegal, and morally reprehensible discrimination in their admissions. Now, we know this for a couple of reasons. One, because Harvard itself did an internal research study, which it then tried to hide from the public, that said it was discriminating in its racial admissions process, particularly against Asian American students. We only know about this because of the second reason, which is the pending litigation against Harvard. The trial's been held, we're awaiting a decision from a judge, but the evidence that has come out in that case makes it very clear that Harvard has been discriminating, particularly against Asian American students, in exactly the same way and using the same Harvard plan that it came up with in the 1920s to keep Jewish students out of schools. But the third reason we know about this is because of the groundbreaking study by Dr. Althea Nagai. She took a look at those schools, including my alma mater, MIT, which I'm embarrassed to admit is one of the schools that started discriminating, particularly against Asian American students in the 1990s, in contrast to the school that was our big tech rival when I was at MIT, Caltech, which has never discriminated on the basis of race and does not discriminate on the basis of race in its admissions. Now, one of the problems in the Harvard lawsuit was the fact that it was a private institution and they spent a lot of their money, and they have the largest endowment in the country, to hire very good lawyers to hide their admission records. But the advantage of the 5 schools that Althea looked at is they're public institutions, which made it possible to get the records. Now, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits discrimination in the educational setting on the grounds of race, color, or national origin. The Supreme Court has held that racial classifications, particularly with admissions, are only constitutional if they are narrowly tailored to further compelling government interests. And the only acceptable interest is, and here these are lawyers talking, I'll simplify this in a minute. The only interest is the benefit of student body diversity that encompasses a broad array of qualifications and characteristics of which racial or ethnic origin is but a single element. In essence, what that means is you can't have racial quotas. You can't use race as your primary factor in admissions. It can be a plus factor. What that simply means is if you have 2 students with similar grades, similar credentials, similar qualifications, you could use the race of one as a plus factor to allow that student in. But you can't do any of that unless you have first engaged in a serious, good faith consideration of workable race-neutral alternatives. There is no evidence whatsoever that any of these schools, particularly the 2 worst schools in Virginia, which are the schools that consider themselves the elite schools of Virginia, William and Mary and the University of Virginia, and they had the worst numbers in this study. There is no evidence whatsoever that they have tried to have some alternative way of a race-neutral alternative. In fact, the study shows they are engaging in blatant racial discrimination. Now, how blatant is this? There are a lot of numbers in Althea's study, and you can get lost in numbers. I learned that when I took statistical analysis at MIT, which is a weird class for a lawyer to take. But here's how you know what's going on. In one part of the study, you'll find that Althea's analysis showed that students with similar test scores, similar grades, their admittance rate at UVA, if they were black, is 74%. Students with the same grade, same credentials, who are Hispanic, their admittance rate is 46%. If the students are white, their admittance rate is 30%. And the students who are discriminated against the most are Asian Americans who, with the same test scores and credentials as all these other students, only have a 25% admittance rate. The gap between white admittees and black admittees is 180 points on the SAT. Even worse is William and Mary, which is the most discriminatory college in the state of Virginia. Again, same qualifications, same grades, same test scores, black admittance rate 80%, Hispanic admittance rate 58%, white admittance rate 17%, Asian American admittance rate 10%. The black-white gap in the SAT score, 190 points. UVA, Althea found, rejected almost 2,300 applicants to that school despite having higher grades and better test scores than black students who were admitted. William and Mary did the same thing. Now, all of this should come as no surprise that the schools that consider themselves the most elite schools in Virginia are engaging in this kind of racial discrimination in accordance with the same thing that the elite schools are. A couple of years ago, the former dean of admissions at MIT, a woman named Marilee Jones, displayed the same kind of stereotyping that is occurring in all these admissions officers, particularly in the discrimination against Asian American students. When commenting on a Korean American student applying to MIT, she said that the student, quote, looked like 1,000 other Korean kids with the exact same profile of grades and activities and temperament, yet another textureless math grind. In other words, to MIT's former chief of admissions, all Asians look alike. By the way, the Harvard Law School lawsuit revealed that twice a year, Harvard has been going to a secret meeting with 15 other schools, including Columbia, Cornell, Dartmouth, MIT, Princeton, Stanford, the University of Pennsylvania, and Yale, to compare their racial admission numbers. The purpose of this meeting is to coordinate their manipulation of the admissions process to ensure that all the schools have approximately the same racial percentage of admissions and no university is statistically out of line with others. In other words, they have a racial quota system in place. By the way, many of these schools filed amicus briefs in the Harvard case on the side of Harvard, along with Duke, Emory, George Washington, and Johns Hopkins, because they want to be able to continue to discriminate. Now, not only is this a violation of the Civil Rights Act, but it is morally wrong. Why? Universities now in Georgia, UVA and William and Mary, are basically telling students who've worked hard through elementary school, middle school, and high school in order to excel in academics and extracurricular activities that these universities, what's more important to them is their skin color and ethnic background. That's more important than their dedication, hard work, and character. What UVA and William and Mary are doing today isn't any different than what they were doing in the 1960s before the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The only thing that has changed is the color of the individuals they are discriminating against and the color of the individuals they are discriminating in favor of. Now, what needs to be done about this? These are state schools. As I said, that's fortunate. That's how they were able to get the records of it. And what the Virginia legislature needs to do, and that's specifically the chairman of the Senate Committee on Education and Health and the House of Delegates Committee on Education, is frankly they need to hold hearings and they need to pull the head of those universities before them. And if the universities don't stop discriminating on the basis of race, those individuals need to be fired, and this has to be stopped at these universities. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Hans. Todd?
Thank you. And before I thank CEO further, why don't I suggest some of the folks blocked by my podium may wish to come over to the seats that we used to occupy. I'm not much to look at, but you know, Hans and my good friend Ted are really lookers. But
so kind.
But I do want to thank CEO for giving me the opportunity to comment on their new study, and especially for undertaking it. I think the findings are interesting on a number of levels. I'm only going to take 10 minutes to try to hit what some of the most important ones, but I'll mention two briefly I'm not going to talk much about. I think it's quite interesting that the Virginia Tech and GMU, and to a moderate extent JMU, give pretty strong preferences to out-of-state students rather than in-state students. I think this should interest Virginia residents like me and our legislature. I have no special expertise in these financial and distributional issues, but I don't like it. So if you ask me in questions, I'll say why I don't think it's probably worth the extra loot that these colleges get. Second, legacy preferences. They may be relevant to the extent that they are large, and they may impact other preferences. To the extent that the legacy preference could be large and the historic pattern of admissions favored whites, for example. But apart from that, I think reasonable people can debate the merits and demerits of legacy and sports preferences independently. Now, admissions preferences based on race and ethnicity are categorically, functionally, and constitutionally distinct from these other categories, especially when they're large. And I'll explain that a little bit more. Actually, I'll explain it now. The size makes it much more questionable that this is the result of thousands of individual determinations where it was just a minor plus factor. It looks very much to me and some of my colleagues who litigate equal protection like this is a system, protectional system of racial balancing. And so I am here today on behalf of the Pacific Legal Foundation inviting students who think they may have been harmed by illegal discrimination under the federal laws and the Constitution to contact us. We want to look into this, especially if they are interested in potentially suing to seek justice for such violation. But I'm not going to talk about the law the rest of my prepared remarks. What I'm going to focus on is the growing evidence of severe negative consequences for any student who is admitted with starting credentials, starting a preparation that's significantly below their peers. The social science evidence is strong and growing that such extreme preferences harm minority students who are unwittingly recruited and romanced to attend these universities so that they get their numbers right. It destroys thousands of students' dreams, saddles them with debt, and leaves them with either no degrees or less productive degrees that they really didn't want when they would have had succeeded fabulously at other colleges if they had not been wrongly induced to attend these elite institutions. The harm is especially clear and acute for students who want to study the science and engineering schools, but the evidence also shows that the effect is the same at any especially competitive program, such as UVA's 8th-ranked business college and similar programs at William & Mary. So I'm going to focus my explanation of this very harmful effect on students who want to study the science, technology, engineering, math, or STEM fields, because when I was a commissioner on the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, we did a very careful study of this. The commission in October of 2010 issued, I think, a very strong report with some powerful recommendations that I will end with. Well, the Civil Rights Commission's report found the following. African American and Hispanic students show, and this is, we thought, quite interesting, but then we understood why, a slightly greater interest in studying the STEM fields than whites, but that makes some sense because this is a traditional path to prosperity, and relatively less well-off students might be interested in it more than, people who come from comfortable families. Now, perhaps for the same reason, the desire to succeed, the commission also found that African American and Hispanic students succeeded at higher rates than whites, but only when their entry credentials were similar to their classmates. The report has a great section on how successful the historically black colleges and universities are, amazing success at graduating even a higher percentage than normal of their students in science fields and sending them to graduate study. Of course, they don't give preferences on the basis of race to African American or Hispanic students. The commission found no evidence of significant discrimination for African Americans or Hispanics once they're admitted in these programs. However, we did find evidence that showed a significant negative mismatch in minority students' relative preparation compared to their classmates was a major cause of many of those students to fail to complete a STEM degree or to graduate with a lower grade point average when they were given this large preference. Now, we know that those who even get the degree but have low grades, low class rank, are much less likely to be admitted to graduate schools, competitive graduate schools in medicine, engineering, PhD programs. So how extreme is the evidence of discrimination? Althea and Hans covered most of that. But I am going to say that the CEO's published report didn't compare the odds ratio between the most favored group and the most discriminated against group, and that's Asians. And so I asked Althea, and yesterday she ran some numbers for me, and here's some of what you can either pull out of the report or that Althea related to me. First of all, they both talked about the 180 to 190 gap between African American, SAT, and whites, but it's 240 between the median African American and the median Asian at both UVA and William and Mary. So the difference between the median African American and the median all other students is higher than 180 and 190. But the odds ratio, which is maybe the most sensitive type of measure that Althea told me yesterday, was that, actually, let's just think about the odds ratios for a minute. What do they even mean? If some practice makes you twice as likely to get cancer, or twice as likely to win a major sports award, we would think that's significant. We'd want to know about it, and we might change our behavior. So, what was the odds ratio when adjusted from worst to best? William and Mary, African Americans, are 37.9 times more likely to be admitted than similarly situated Asians. And Hispanics are 12.9 times more likely than similarly situated Asians. Now, Linda told us that that was a little better than 1999, but that sounds like about 1996. It doesn't sound to me like it's much improvement. Now, why does this matter? How does this really hurt them? Isn't it always better to go to the topmost elite college? Well, some people will exceed expectations, but most do not. And it's particularly hard to exceed expectations in STEM fields, particularly when your average credentials are much lower than your classmates. These fields are cumulative and rigorously competitive, so that if you struggle in your first semester calculus or chemistry or physics, because it's taught at a faster and higher rate than you're used to, you're generally going to do worse in subsequent semesters, because the worst students wash out, and it's always graded on a curve. It's not like the kind of fields I studied. Now, let me go over the one study by Dartmouth professor Rogers. Really? Give me. I will skip the Rogers-Elliott study. I timed this before a couple times, but I must have ad-libbed an awful lot. Okay. I will, hopefully in the question and answer time, mention what the three most important of the 5 recommendations were, but I'll mention what the single nugget was. We did have a recommendation to improve preparedness that was unanimous, but more importantly, we recommended that the universities disclose the truth to the people that they induce. They know how it hurts their performance, and I'm asking UVA and William and Mary not to serve their own selfish institutional interests to get the numbers right, but to fully disclose to students how what their likelihood of graduating in their chosen field is when they could go to other colleges and do fabulously well.
Thank you. Ted?
Well, first, let me thank Federalist Society. Let me thank you all for inviting me, for coming here to mix it up with you. I have said in many instances when I've come to Federalist Society functions that I do this in spite of some of my my colleagues and friends who are simpatico, because perhaps naively I believe it's important to talk to people with whom we disagree, especially at this time. But it's also out of a more selfish view that I don't think I want to see the views that some of my adversaries, not my enemies, but my adversaries hold, go unchallenged, even in their own forums. So I'm happy to be here, and I've now known every one of the people on this panel for a number of years and mixed it up with them before. Let me start by, though, saying this, that I'm struck by how the study, which is interesting, to say the least, by the reactions and how much of the focus is on African Americans. When, if you look at it carefully, there's also a lot in it that talks about the ways in which Asian Americans outperform white standardized test takers. There's a lot we don't know about test taking. And there's an interesting book called The Black-White Test Score Gap that I recommend to you. It's been around for quite some time. But we're still learning about how people learn, how they test, et cetera, all kinds of folks. And there are a couple of things I want to say right off the bat, that's important to understand. One is that if you go to the people who make standardized tests and you press them, they will tell you that standardized tests should not be used as the sole criterion in admissions and high-stakes decisions. Now, I'm not telling you that that's what happens in colleges and universities, although part of this discourse, for example, recently has pointed up Stuyvesant High School, and a lot of people are upset about the way Stuyvesant High School in New York is being pressed to change its admission standards, and there the test is solely the criterion for admissions. The test takers won't support that, but they'll go to the bank on it as long as it isn't challenged. So I get that, I understand that, but I just want to point out that standardized tests, I'm not opposed to their use for any purpose. They tell us something. They don't tell us often as much as what people think they tell us, but they do tell us something. And I realize that I could be walking on a high wire rather, and get in trouble when I say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. There are some countries or some cultures in which standardized testing has a huge, or is a huge determinant in terms of opportunity, educational opportunities, life opportunities, et cetera. And there's some countries not so much. We're in the United States, we have this notion that standardized tests mean more than I will suggest that they do mean or should mean. And the reason I say that is because standardized testing is not understood very well in appropriate contexts. So we assume that anybody with a standardized test score that is lower than somebody else is more qualified, or who gets in, or should get in. So let me tell you a quick story. I'm the Julius L. Chambers Distinguished Professor of Law at UNC. UNC, the first public university, discriminated against African Americans, wouldn't admit them right on up and through the 1950s and really into the 60s for the most part. Julius Chambers, you probably don't know who he was. Google him. He was my boss, my mentor, a friend. Julius Chambers from a poor town, tiny town, Mount Gilead in North Carolina. When he was admitted to UNC Law School, I wish I had time to tell you his whole story, but when he was admitted to UNC Law School, ranked somewhere around 212 out of 214 applicants. He got in by the skin of his teeth, ranked in large part because of test scores. Graduated in the class of 1962. This segregated institution didn't treat him well while he was there. Julius graduated #1 in his class and editor-in-chief of Law Review. I want you to marinate on that for a moment. 212 out of 214, one in his class, editor-in-chief of Law Review, couldn't get a job interview anywhere in the South or anywhere else, for that matter, out of a law firm. So I could say a lot more about the significance of that, but I hope you think about it and see it. The other thing I want to say about where we are, it is, with all due respect, Hans, it is absolutely absurd to say that what institutions of higher education are doing, whatever the merits, there's an argument to be made about admissions and the way admissions is done at selective institutions. There are many arguments that can be made about it. But whatever those arguments may be, to suggest that these institutions are discriminating either against Asian Americans or white Americans, as they did in the 1920s against Jews or as they did against African Americans, is absurd. There is an issue, as I say, to talk about with respect to Asian Americans, because I believe there is discrimination, and has been, at some selective institutions against Asian Americans if you use standardized test scores in the way many people think they should be used. I don't agree that they should be used in exactly that way. But if you were Jewish in the 1920s, you didn't get into Harvard, period. If you were black, Lord knows you didn't get into almost any of these institutions. They saw you were black and that was it, out. That's not what happens to white students these days. Nobody looks at white students and says they're white, they don't get in. Whether they have the same profile, academic or profile or test scores, that's a question we could talk about and debate. But to say that it's the same kind of discrimination that went on under Jim Crow segregation and exclusion is absurd. So let me then, because I know my time is running out and there's a whole lot more I could say, institutions don't guarantee admissions to people because they have high test scores or GPAs, or higher test scores and GPAs. They look at a whole lot of factors. They don't admit people who are misanthropes. They admit people who may have other characteristics or show other experiences in life. I am not a big fan of Bakke in many ways. That's another conversation we can have. Because Bakke betrayed the 14th Amendment and its original purpose and intent. We could have that discourse if we had more time. Saying that, however, having said that, it's the Supreme Court, it's Powell who adopted the diversity rationale. At the same time, it threw under the bus the remedial rationale, that is trying to remedy the 400 years of discrimination, now 400 years this year, against African Americans, but 350 of those years in which, pursuant to law, either through slavery or Jim Crow segregation, African Americans were subordinated. Is it any surprise, or should it be any surprise, that African Americans, in one way or another, still demonstrate the effects of those 350 years? Do you really expect them to have the same profiles educationally financially, health conditions and everything else as white people do, that's an absurd expectation. So I hope you're getting that point. We still have unfinished work. Think of it this way. 8 out of every 10 days of the presence of African Americans in what's now the United States has been spent under legal subordination, either in slavery or Jim Crow segregation. That's why Justice O'Connor and one of her former clerks, when she wrote when she was off the court, you don't need to pass it down. I'll stop. But that's
I went
why.
on for an extra minute. So.
No, let me just finish this sentence. That's why when they wrote an article after the Michigan cases, she clarified this 25-year business and talked about the fallacy of lumping together all of these groups, African Americans, white Americans, Asian Americans, et cetera. It's a mistake to do that. It's a dishonest discourse. So I could say a whole lot more, but I'm forced to stop here. Again, thank you for inviting me. Thank you for your work and your study, and I hope we can engage some more.
Thank you all for excellent commentary, each and every one of you. And I want to invite Althea to come back up and take a seat. And you'll know it's not me, but I don't think we have a name place for her. I would like to be able to open it up for questions from the audience. And if you can, just identify yourself. And if you have a particular person on the panel that you'd like to ask the question, direct it. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Mr. Spakovsky, if you don't mind, I'll ask you a question about MIT. As you know, women and math is an issue, and it's my understanding that Caltech does not discriminate against men in admissions also. I have a colleague who is an alumnus of MIT, and the story that the university has put out to its alumni is that, we have discovered women that are good at math in unusual places. We've gone to the Catholic schools, we've recruited them, and as a result, we have greatly expanded our female enrollment and not changed our standards at all. And my friend and I talked about this and said, well, gee, that's interesting. I wonder if it's true. It's a possibility. I said, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a straight out lie. I mean, look, Althea did a study about this, which I looked at, and I have to admit I went to MIT in the 1980s. By the way, when the percentage of women was only 20%, it's now over 50. Fortunately for me, because I met my wife there. But anyway, at MIT, for example, and this is particularly true with regard to Asian Americans, okay, the percentage of Asian Americans getting accepted was going steadily up, matching the increase in the population of Asian Americans in the country and the increase in their admissions to colleges. And then at this point in the 1990s, it's just stopped and started staying the same level, even though the number of Asian Americans in the population is still steadily going up. And all you have to do is compare those percentages over the years of admissions to Caltech. And if you look at it today, MIT and Caltech, which are the two best engineering schools in the country, if not the world. Okay, very similar backgrounds. They're looking for very similar types of people in the STEM fields. Asian American, the percentage of Asian Americans as part of the Caltech student population is almost twice that of MIT. There is no reason for that other than blatant discrimination. And I have to disagree with my friend Ted Shaw. Ted probably doesn't remember this, but the first time we ever encountered each other was now almost 20 years ago when we were both on a panel. It was my first time testifying in front of Congress, and we got into a fight then, too.
A disagreement.
A disagreement,
Polite
yes.
disagreement.
You cannot blame this anymore on just test scores and differences in test scores, because all the studies that are now being done, including the one Althea did, they don't just look at test scores. They look at test scores, grades, and other credentials. And in the Harvard litigation, the evidence came out very clearly, for example, that Asian American students with higher test scores, higher grade histories, more extracurricular activities, and personal interviews with Harvard alums who did the student interviews across the country and got great personal interview ratings back, we're still being discriminated against and not let into the school in comparison to other students of other races, Hispanics, whites, African Americans, who were worse in all four of those categories. There's no explanation for that other than discrimination against Asian American students. And they are the ones, there's no question of that, they are the ones getting the worst of this, not just in the elite schools, but we can see this at William and Mary and UVA too.
Let me ask, if you want to ask a question, if you'll come up to the microphone. Thank you.
Kurt Levy, Committee for Justice. First, a very quick comment. If test scores are discriminatory, schools should stop using them instead of, remedying that by discriminating against whites and Asians. But my question is about, to whatever degree the size of the plus factor or preference, whatever you want to call it, has decreased. And I guess I'll break this into two questions, one for Ted and one for the other people on the panel. I guess for Ted, is that, from your perspective, is that good news? The fact that the plus factor is becoming smaller, is that a good thing or a bad thing? And then for Todd and Hans, why do you think it's becoming smaller? I mean, just off the top of my head, it could be that, maybe the test score gap, racial test score gap is lessening, or maybe schools are relying more on socioeconomic factors, or maybe they've, maybe it's court rulings. I mean, you could say the court rulings haven't gone our way, but I do kind of feel like after Gratz and Grutter, people took the limitations on the use of race a little more seriously than they did after Bakke. But anyway, for you two, why do you think the gap is a little bit smaller?
Well, there is, first let me point out that the paper that we're looking at here, it's interesting that the GPAs are much more closely aligned among all the groups. The gaps are not as significant as the test score gap. I think that calls for more thought about admissions and how we use these standards, et cetera. And I'm not arguing that there's no difference in GPAs, but once again, I go back, and this is not about excuses. I mean, this is fact. Look at the nature of the educational opportunities at the elementary and secondary school level, and you recognize that this is something that we need to talk about. In the article that I mentioned that former Justice O'Connor wrote along with her former clerk, she has a piece that talks about those issues and the effect of educational quality and segregation, et cetera, in schools that are highly segregated, attended by African American students in particular. Do I think that it's a good thing that there's a narrowing of these differences? I think that's the question that you're asking.
Well, the size of the plus factor has gotten a little bit small.
So if the plus factor size can shrink, or we can shrink it, and at the same time not ending up excluding whole groups of people from opportunity at these institutions, sure, that's a good thing. I don't see any problem with that. I mean, that's a good thing. There has been, and I think part of this discourse is in some ways undergirded by the rumors of inferiority, but at the same time, we've seen the gap, even on standardized tests, change over time with respect to African Americans. But also look at the people who are being admitted to the Harvards and many of these institutions who are black. Increasingly, they are not the sons and the daughters of the African American slavery to Jim Crow continuum. Many of them are immigrants from Africa and from Asia. I'm sorry, and the Caribbean. Don't get me wrong. I am glad they're at those institutions, but I'm still talking about who's not here. And the continuum that is our history in this country that we only began to address, at best, 50 years ago.
Do you want to either, Todd, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll just say I'm not sure how much it has shrunk. One hypothesis I have, found very interesting for the narrowing of the GPA is one possible explanation is just grade inflation. Generally, everyone gets an A. Especially if you take A+, then it counts as 4.4 or whatever. The other is that's a relative measure within an institution because of sort of segregation, not necessarily whether it's legally enforced segregation or not. Ethnic, a lot of schools' composition will be ethnically similar, and therefore it's not a good comparator. Whereas the standardized test scores really are the single best predictor of performance. And to Ted's point that they shouldn't be the only one, I would say the data don't lie. And all the studies of mismatch take these standardized scores, and if he is right that they're not a very good predictor of future success, then they would show that these universities have figured out exactly when they give these massive preferences based on test scores that they were right. But no, the data do not lie. And in the Dartmouth study, the author looked at 11 institutions and one score, and it wasn't even all of SAT, it was math SAT. So based on math SAT alone, the top third of the students who were in the top third of their class in those 11 institutions graduated in their chosen degree between 49 and 62%. That's a pretty narrow band, around 55%. That's not a lot, but these are hard subjects. Using math SAT alone in these 11 institutions, they graduated in a very tight band between 11.2 and 20.8% for an average of 16%. That is terrible. It's terrible for the students who are induced to go to those institutions when they would have done fabulously well otherwise, and their dreams are destroyed. So we can wish that tests aren't great predictor, but the data don't lie.
I just want to add something about this.
Before we have repeat questioners, I just asked for.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Just a quick thing on the mismatch theory. People need to understand that the mismatch theory has absolutely nothing to do with race. The whole point of it is that if you are a student and you don't have the same training and lower credentials than other students in your class, you're going to do badly no matter what your race or ethnic background. It has nothing to do with race. I know that. Because when I got to MIT, I had done very well in high school, but I was suddenly in a school with people who were to go on to win Nobel Prizes. And that's probably one of the reasons I got out of the hard sciences and switched to the law. The point is, when you allow students to come in, no matter what their race or ethnicity, and their credentials are below that of the rest of the class, they're going to have a very difficult time. They're going to get discouraged, and that's why their graduation rates of people with who were let in with those lower rates are worse, whereas if they went to a lower-ranked school where they would be in the middle or even the top of the entering class, they not only would do well, they would graduate, they would do very well. That's the problem with the mismatch theory. It's going to hurt any students that are let in with lower credentials.
And by the way, when CEO first started doing our studies, we used to look at 6-year graduation rates, and it usually that data confirmed exactly what you're saying. Yes.
I'm going to propose a possible defense.
Name, I know who you are, Ken, but
not
everyone.
I'm Ken, yeah. Okay, so I'm going to propose a possible defense of Harvard and UVA's policies that discriminate against Asian Americans. And I propose it in terms of a thought experiment that was inspired by a comment by Hans. What if these institutions no longer admitted women, that they were men only, like Harvard and UVA were not all that many years ago, would there be this disparity against Asians? And what I'm proposing is that Asian Americans, what I'm proposing is that part of the reason for elite schools doing this is to ensure that that white women who get admitted have more choice in terms of the men they seek out, which would ordinarily be among white men, not so much among Asian or black or possibly Hispanic men. So I think that may be one reason that elite schools practice a kind of eugenics in wanting to perpetuate.
Well, that's a controversial question.
I have another more controversial one, but I decline to state it.
Okay. Anybody want to respond to that?
I will just say that having two daughters, one of whom works for Microsoft and knows more about the hard sciences than I do, I think the idea that that women would not be getting into these elite engineering schools unless there were some kind of preference, I just think that doesn't match their capabilities. I just don't think that's right.
But there is a gap in many higher educational institutions that very few people talk about between men and women, with women outperforming men and being admitted at lower rates in many of these institutions because the institutions think that they need to maintain some gender diversity.
Yeah, I'll comment on what Ted just said. The Civil Rights Commission, when I was there, subpoenaed or requested and then tried to subpoena information from schools to get at this question of what the extent of discrimination was. This is against women because women outperform men. And I have to say, the commission majority then changed and they quashed the report, and much to my anger, I thought it was illegal that they, I think, dispensed with the evidence because they didn't want it to be released. But part of that's explained by interesting things that men would go in the military and the business trades, and there may be some other explanations, but there seemed to be reasonable evidence that the discrimination is against women now and not against men.
Yes.
Yeah, my question is for Mr. Shaw.
And your name?
Oh, Jake.
Jake.
Denton. I'm with the Federalist Society. I'm a research associate. My question for you, Mr. Shaw, is what are your thoughts on the introduction of the adversity score by the College Board? And in general, are you for or against it?
First, and I'm not, I want to talk about that. I neglected, Kurt, to say I haven't seen you in a long time, and nice to see you again.
And if I could just add, I think one thing I've gotten from all my conversations with you is to take more seriously your argument about 350 years. And although the law precludes us from remedying societal discrimination, I'll always remember your remark about if schools can't do it, who's going to do it? So,
yeah, and that's bad jurisprudence. That's Baki, the betrayal of the 14th Amendment. But I digress. Your question, I'm still thinking about that issue. Probably most of us, even if we're advocates of attempts to admit people from groups who are disadvantaged, most of us probably have a little discomfort. Some people have even more about enshrining disadvantage as a permanent feature in determining how opportunity is available. I will confess to that, although that doesn't lead me to say that the inequality that exists in our society and that continues to exist in our society should be left alone as if it's some kind of, to quote some language from a couple of cases involving race and the 14th Amendment, some kind of in the nature of things phenomenon. So I'm still trying to struggle through what this means for institutions. I think that if people have experienced in their lives certain things that mask what their abilities are, that institutions ought to be able to look at that, regardless of their race. You know, I think poor and working class white people in this country get the short end of the stick in many instances. And institutions need to think about where they come from, who they are, and whether or not the standards that we used are still reflective of what their capabilities are and how we ought to treat them in admissions. The one thing we know about standardized tests is that they do reflect economic privilege. I might get some pushback on that, but I'm pretty certain that that's what the data show. So I'm not opposed to it in an absolute sense, but I hope that it ends up not being a permanent feature and that we continue to try to fight against disparities and inequality so that it needn't be.
Thank you.
Let me just follow up on that with both Hans and Todd, because some people have suggested that if our real aim is to try to help disadvantaged students, that disadvantaged social and economic status could in fact be a factor. And I want to get Hans's response and then Todd's, because you came at it from very different perspectives. Hans, if in fact the schools decided that they were going to use social and economic status and take a look at parental income, parental education, et cetera, and give a plus factor for students who were coming from a disadvantaged background, there'd be nothing in the 14th Amendment with respect to state schools, correct, that would run afoul of?
The problem with that is the devil, of course, is in the details. And what I would fear is that admissions
forces you to.
I'm afraid admissions officers would use that as a cover for engaging in racial and ethnic discrimination unless the standards are very strict. And no, the admissions folks aren't going to want that. They like what they call the holistic approach, which is basically a way that they can discriminate on any basis that they want to. And the problem with this is seen by the fact that if you actually look at the socioeconomic makeup of students, minority students who get into the elite schools, you will find that the vast majority of them actually come from well-off, middle-class families whose parents are professionals. They are not folks from the lower end of the spectrum. I probably would not have qualified for that, even though my parents met in a refugee camp in Europe and came to the United States with not a dime to their name. But I would probably be considered the wrong race and the wrong color to be considered for that in these schools.
But in fact, as Althea's study that she did last year for us on Asians, one of the things that is striking in terms of the data on Asians is that many of these are first generation. They are coming from families who do suffer some social and economic stress, so they would not be disadvantaged by this. And as Ted suggested, there are communities of whites in America who, if it was in fact not used as a cover for trying to really get at race, but really looking at social and economic advantage, my point was there wouldn't be anything in the 14th Amendment or the civil rights laws that would prevent that, so long as the intention was not racial discrimination. But Todd, I want to get your reaction, because would we still have the mismatch problem?
Yes, and let me get to that second. The first is that schools and school systems that have actually, states who pass these, top 10, top 20, whatever laws, who've looked into this, generally don't settle on it because they've been looking into it as a proxy for race. And what they find is that it helps more poor whites. As a percentage, certain minorities may be poor, but since there's more whites in the country generally, there are more poor whites, and it doesn't give them the racial balance. So that's one of the reasons that it hasn't been seriously sought. But it also is just, what is your purpose of, if you're an elite university, maybe there should not be any elite public universities. And maybe there shouldn't be any elite universities. But if you're going to have elite universities and you're going to have this kind of stuff, disadvantagedness, that one of the theories was, well, kids with similar SAT scores who are disadvantaged are harder strivers, and that's a wonderful wishful theory, but it only goes so far. And disadvantagedness in itself doesn't predict. It's really hard to catch up in, let's say, the STEM fields when everyone is working doggedly hard. Now, maybe you could catch up in the kind of majors I took if you weren't well prepared, history and other fluffy things like that. And you could take a couple years to get there. But in the STEM fields, it's you're going to do the disadvantaged students more harm by telling them that they can compete when they're not really ready for it.
Yeah, Althea?
Yeah, I want to go back to that Harvard study because it's amazing what discovery we'll come up with. Yeah. Because the statistician at Harvard did look at income. And the other group that was discriminated against, controlling for their multiple factors, besides Asian Americans, were poor African Americans. That was a surprise. That Harvard's playing some kind of, well, we allot so many to athletes, we allot so many donors, so many to alums, that, again, there was a disproportionate number, I think Ted brought this, that there were the children of African immigrants and Caribbean immigrants. A lot of the matriculants were athletes, but we're talking about women on the field hockey team. There are a lot of us who have played field hockey in high school, right? So we have these games that are being played at the elite university level, and I have to mention the University of Chicago is now become test optional. They've decided that it does. Maybe it plays too much of a barrier, and this is the big experiment because they get thousands and thousands of applicants, and we want to see what the outcome is. They're not stupid about going into this, that if they're going to pull from especially local kids, there's a lot of supplemental resources. There are summer programs. In fact, one condition, I think, if they're going to use if they're going to have these kinds of disparities, it would behoove a potential student to go to a small elite liberal arts college where you have a whole mess of student advisors or bureaucrats that keep an eye out on. They keep an eye, support system, a real support system. You're not going to get that at with a student body of 27,000.
If I could just add, well, I'll go Ted first, and then I'll.
So, and I know we have a couple of people online and we need to get to, but let me, because my head is about to explode about a couple of things. First, with all due respect, Hans, when you talk about your family coming here, and I think I might be too presumptuous, we talking about post-World War II?
Yes.
At that time? Okay. Look, I get, coming from camps, I don't know the particular experiences, et cetera. I'm glad that America was the beacon for people after World War II that it was. And I hope it remains that beacon, but that's another discussion. But here's the thing. When you say your family or you or, wrong color, come on. They came here at a time when there was unfinished business in this country that went back hundreds of years that was about the racial subordination of African Americans. So how can you talk about you come to this country or your family, and I'm glad they came here, but to talk about they were the wrong color when at that time it was the post-World War II years that saw the wealth that was built among white families largely through the FHA and home ownership. Most families, the equity is there. If you don't know this story, read the book by Richard Rothstein, The Color of Money. But black folks weren't allowed to build that wealth at that time. And you talk about you were the wrong color. As soon as you came here, your people came here, you right away had that disadvantage. Now, I'm not blaming them. But to see it as they were the wrong color and black people being the ones who were advantaged by race is grotesque.
You are mischaracterizing what I said. What my point.
Well, then I apologize if I did.
My point is the way to stop discriminating. The way to stop discriminating on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race.
I thought you were going there.
Okay.
I've heard that somewhere before.
Yeah, and my point is that when my children applied to schools in Virginia, it would be fundamentally unfair to discriminate against them on the basis of their color. No one denies what happened in the past in this country, but you do not punish individuals who are here today to remedy past acts of discrimination. And that is what the schools in Virginia are doing to particularly Asian American students.
Well, I think there's more discussion to have on that point.
We could have more discussion on that, but I'm going to take the prerogative of the chair and move to another question.
Thanks so much, especially for the second question. All right, I'll address this to anybody who would like to comment on it. Back to Asians, who also had a pretty nasty time of it in this country, especially on the West Coast. Not as bad as blacks, but it was no picnic. If we take the narrative, which I think the schools would like us to, that it's a holistic consideration, and there's a mosaic and we're making individual decisions, what comes out of that with respect to the Asians is essentially they fail on the personality side. We just find the way that whole individual side, apart from test scores and grades, you all are deficient. And to me, this is so effectively racist, really, really nasty. I don't know if anybody else, that's been taken for what it really means. You know, if you address that to any other group.
Question? Can we get
all
to
right, the question is, so we're really better off, aren't we, just being obvious about, no, this is a racial balancing game, and that's what we're doing, and nobody is, nobody is deficient. This is just how we're doing the politics.
Well, look, I agree that admissions officers who are engaging in that kind of thinking and review of Asian American applicants, they fail personality tests, et cetera, that's shameful. I'm not going to support that. But that doesn't mean that we do not have the unfinished business in this country with respect to opportunities for African Americans in particular, who have been subordinated, as I said, 8 out of every 10 days of their presence here. Now, if what you're saying, the statement that the way to stop discrimination is to stop discrimination assumes, as does much of the jurisprudence right now in this Supreme Court, that that the link between past racial discrimination against African Americans and present-day inequality, which I don't think anybody can deny, has become so attenuated as to not have any significance. We can ignore that. Then we're in a different place from one another. I say that we still have that unfinished work with respect to African Americans, and whatever has happened to Asian Americans, we need to talk about that. And there we can talk about, the need to stop discriminating. But to equate opportunities to efforts to open opportunities for African Americans with the kind of racism that existed historically to which they were subjected is just not intellectually honest.
Let me
just quickly, because we do want to get to the last question.
Honesty is always the best policy, but one other false story relating to what Althea said is that we have all these supports. We have every elite institution. By the way, justifiably, it's good that they have these support, but it only helps the studies show it only helps in a modest amount for a modest deficiency. So that's another part of the false narrative to these children.
Yes, last question, and identify yourself.
Hi, Kyle Fields. And just so you know where I'm coming from, I find Justice Alito's Fisher's 2 dissent particularly compelling. So I'm interested in some of these like percent plans that would focus more on socioeconomic status. My question with respect to the study is, how do you feel about legacy as a factor in admissions, and is there a potential for that to be nefarious either with respect to racial classification sort of as a proxy or overriding opportunities for people who might be socioeconomically disadvantaged?
And could I just throw this first to Althea, because we didn't spend a whole lot of time on legacy, but legacies were in fact preferred at least at a couple of the schools.
William and Mary, there was a large preference for legacy. And of course, legacy is a very big factor at a place like Harvard. And of course, you know, the history of legacy, it excludes, prefers some people. Every university can reduce the number of legacies. And we don't know how much of that is, well, they have all these legacies because, you know, you want a big financial donation or something. We have no idea. I mean, obviously, realistically, there is a financial incentive. There's a donor class. As we all know from all these scandals, it's a big deal. And those are they're not rigid set-asides, but it looks like, because we don't have full access to the data. Unlike these Virginia schools that were really good about turning over their data, be praised here. The private universities never give us data because they said, oh, we're private, blah, 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 blah. So we don't know what they do. We just know what they say they do. And then there's a scandal, there's a lawsuit, and we find that you know, if you give $1 million to like their hockey team or something, or the coach, buy them a house. Okay, you want your kid to get to Harvard, buy them a house. That universities can always say, no, we're going to reduce the alum factor. MIT does not use alum status as a factor when it makes admissions. It blatantly comes out, it says so. We do not look at whether or not there's a legacy factor. So it can be done. Caltech does not do that either. That is an individual decision that's a corporate decision by the university, and it's corporate. You do raise the question of how much you want elites to circulate, because these are really gatekeepers to the ruling caste.
What I will tell you about legacy admission, I don't like legacy admissions. I think schools should take kids in based on merit, regardless of who they are and what their race or color is, particularly because most people don't know the history of legacy admissions. Harvard put in legacy admissions in the 1920s as part of the plan by the president of Harvard to limit Jewish students getting into the schools. He had two ways of doing it. He came up with a plan, two ways of doing it. The first was coming up with the so-called Harvard Plan, which looked at the personal characteristics of students in order to be able to keep Jewish students out. But the other reason for the legacy admissions was he said this. He wrote a letter to another professor about what he intended to do. He wanted to preserve the Protestant WASP makeup of the student body. And he said, oh, a way to do that is legacy admissions. If we're admitting the sons of the prior students who were here, then that's another way of preserving the makeup of the student body and keeping Jewish students out at the percentage that they set. And Ted Shaw said earlier, if you're a Jewish student, you need to get it in. No, that's not true. They set up a percentage and said, we're only going to allow a certain percentage of Jewish students in, and anybody above that percentage, no matter how good their credentials, we're not letting them in. But legacy admissions were a key part of keeping Jewish students out of the school.
Yeah, as I said previously, it's a serious problem for schools that have that history of of racism, so I'd eliminate it for that reason. There might be some colleges like Hild still that never did, but I would say eliminate it. And by the way, it's especially offensive, I think, in a public university. But even in a private institution without that history, the perception problem is still there, and I don't think it's worth it.
Yeah, well, let me just quickly say, Hans, you're right that they may have admitted some students who were Jewish, and so I was conscious of that. But my point was that when they discriminated against Jewish students, it was because they were Jewish, period. That was the reason. You didn't even need to show up. Let me just say something about, because you mentioned Justice Alito. Justice Alito and Fisher, there's this, and you may have been thinking about this exchange when he talked about why it would be unfair. Why should a black a child who's the son or the daughter of a doctor get diversity consideration or affirmative action consideration? I thought that exchange was extremely important because for me, it reflected the confusion that Justice Alito and many others, including some others on the court, have about what admissions is and how it works, because the confusion lies in the fact that, as I said, in Bakke, the court threw remedial considerations under the bus and adopted diversity. If diversity is the rationale, then an African American, albeit the son or the daughter of a professional, a doctor or a lawyer, whatever, still may bring something to the table that somebody else may not bring. Just as white students and other students may bring something to the table also. So there's a lot of confusion and misunderstanding, I think, about what I consider to be the betrayal of the 14th Amendment. Lastly, I wanted to point to the wealth gap. I assume that you all are aware of this, the black-white wealth gap, which, the average white family, I think, somewhere around $120,000 in wealth. The average black family, I think, is somewhere around $7,000 or $8,000. That's huge. If you don't believe me, go correct me. But that basically is right. And so that's significant. And it's not just money. It's not just wealth. That's about race and our history with respect to race and subordination, and that has not been remedied yet in our society. It's the unfinished business that we have to attend to, and so I just wanted to raise that up also. Finally, this. Hans, you talked about your personal experience. My personal experience is that I grew up in a public housing project in the Bronx at a time when, because of affirmative action, colleges and universities had closed their door to black people for so long began to come and look for people who could do the work at those institutions. And yes, they took some risks. But my generation of people, they've been successful, most of them, by far, who were admitted pursuant to the things that are under attack here. Doctors and lawyers, attorneys general, physicians, people who have built wealth. I could go on and on about that. So I'm not going to sit here and tell you that whatever your love affair is with standardized tests, that I bow at that altar, and that black folks who have been admitted pursuant to affirmative action have been stigmatized and are not qualified. I don't accept it. You can stay there in that place. I don't accept it, and I don't accept it because of experience.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to let Ted have the last word. I think is befitting the person who's got odds against him at this table. And I want to thank all of the participants. I want to especially thank Althea for her excellent paper and for the excellent work she's been doing for CEO and for other organizations for a number of years. But thank also to Hans and to Todd. And thank you again, Ted. And thank you all for coming.